It feels surreal, almost like a dream, looking back at the years before everything fell apart. I used to think I was living the kind of life that people envy. I had a good job, a beautiful home, and above all, a family. I loved my wife, Sarah, with everything I had. I thought she was the one, my partner for life. We had a son, Jacob, who was everything to me. From the moment he was born, my heart was full in a way I never imagined possible. He was a bright, energetic kid, always asking questions, always challenging me to think. I was proud of him. He made everything feel worth it. Sarah and I met in college. She was smart, funny, and incredibly beautiful. Everyone always said we made the perfect couple, and honestly, I believed them. We clicked from the start. There were no red flags in those early years. Everything seemed easy. There were the usual fights, of course, nothing major, just the little disagreements that come with marriage. But we worked through them. We communicated. We had our little rituals. Sunday mornings were always for pancakes, laughter, and planning the week ahead. Life was comfortable, and I was content. But life, as it often does, has a way of throwing curveballs. I didn't see it coming. How could I? It started with little things. Sarah became more distant. She'd come home late from work, claiming it was just a project or some deadline she had to meet. I trusted her, of course. I didn't have any reason not to. But then, there were the phone calls I wasn't allowed to overhear, the sudden urge to go out with friends, and the long, drawn-out silences at dinner. I convinced myself I was overthinking it. I had a busy schedule too. Maybe it was just stress, or maybe she was just tired. After all, she worked hard. So did I. But something felt off. The worst part? I didn't want to admit it to myself. Even when I started seeing the signs, her avoiding eye contact, the way she would shut down any attempt I made to get close, I ignored them. I didn't want to face the truth, because the truth would mean the end of everything I thought I had. And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to let go of the life I'd spent so many years building. But I couldn't deny it forever. It all came to a head one rainy Tuesday night. I had come home early from work, eager to spend time with Sarah and Jacob. But when I walked into our house, something felt wrong. There was an odd silence that hung in the air. No laughter, no sounds of the TV. The house was too quiet. I went to the kitchen, but Sarah wasn't there. Jacob was, though. He was sitting at the table, doing his homework, but he didn't seem like himself. He was staring at the wall, his usual spark gone. I asked him if everything was okay, but he just nodded, not looking me in the eye. That's when I heard it. Soft laughter, muffled voices coming from our bedroom. I froze. My heart raced as I slowly walked toward the door. And then, I heard a sound that shattered everything, a moan. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It was deeper. I felt my chest tighten, my stomach churn. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. I knew what was happening behind that door. My mind screamed at me to leave, to walk away and forget, but I couldn't. I needed to know. I opened the door, and there they were, Sarah and Jacob. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. My son, my flesh and blood, was lying in our bed with my wife. My mind went blank for a moment, like time had stopped. The world didn't make sense anymore. My entire body felt numb. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, her face turning pale. Jacob's face mirrored hers, a mix of guilt and fear. But it was Sarah who spoke first, her voice a sharp, cold whisper. "You're not supposed to be home yet." I couldn't speak. My world was falling apart in front of me, and I couldn't understand why. I didn't want to understand why. How could she do this? How could both of them do this to me? "Please," she said, her voice softer now. But there was no remorse in it, just irritation. "Just leave, okay?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the walls down, but instead, I just turned around and walked out of the room. My whole body was shaking. I barely even noticed that I had left the house until I was standing in the rain, soaked to the bone, with no idea where I was going. I couldn't process it. The betrayal, the disbelief. I had to get away, but I also needed answers. I needed to know why. Why Jacob? Why her? Why everything? But that, I would discover, was just the beginning of my nightmare. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind was a whirlwind of chaos, spinning around the image of Sarah and Jacob in our bed, wrapped up in something I never thought possible. I didn't know how long I stood outside in the rain, but it was hours before I finally went back inside. The house felt different. There was no comfort there anymore. No warmth. Just emptiness. I didn't even know what to say when I walked through the door. I knew they'd both be there, but I wasn't ready for whatever they were going to say. I wasn't ready to face the wreckage. When I walked into the living room, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her face a mixture of frustration and annoyance. She didn't seem sorry. She didn't seem remorseful at all. She looked at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. It took everything in me to keep my voice steady. What the hell happened? I asked, my voice quiet, trying not to scream. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she looked over at Jacob. He was standing by the door, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. I could see the shame in his face, but there was something else too, something darker. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Sarah, I started, but she cut me off, standing up and walking toward me. There was no softness in her step, no apology in her eyes. I don't owe you an explanation, she said, her voice cold. I don't need to explain myself to you. The words hit me like a slap. I thought I might fall right there, right in front of her. This was my wife, the woman I trusted with everything, with my life, with our family. And she was standing there, looking at me like I was the problem. The anger started to rise in me, but I swallowed it down. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on in her mind. How long? I asked, barely able to get the words out. Sarah didn't hesitate. A few months. I couldn't breathe. A few months? Months of this, behind my back? Of him? Jacob, I muttered, barely recognizing the name coming from my mouth. I turned to him, and this time, I saw it. The fear in his eyes. He was scared. Not for me. Not for the betrayal. No, he was scared for himself. Scared of the consequences. Is this true? I asked him, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, and it felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath me. My son. The one I raised. The one I loved. The one I taught to be better than this. He had slept with my wife. And as much as I wanted to scream, to throw him out, to make him pay for what he'd done, I just stood there, speechless. Why? Was all I could manage to ask. Why her? Why my wife? Jacob opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked to Sarah, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet satisfaction. I could barely register the moment before she spoke. Jacob and I, we're in love, she said, like it was no big deal. Like she wasn't confessing to destroying everything I ever cared about. I've been unhappy for a while, Mark. I thought you knew. You didn't seem to care about me anymore. I didn't feel wanted, desired. And Jacob, well? She paused, glancing at him with a look that made me feel like I was the outsider in my own home. He was there. He made me feel seen again. The words stung like acid in my ears. You used him, I said, the anger rising. But I was still in shock, still numb. I couldn't believe what she was saying. I couldn't believe how she was saying it. There was no shame in her voice. No sorrow. Just coldness, a strange detachment. We were just looking for something, Sarah continued. Something more than what we had with you. My hands balled into fists, and for a moment, I thought I might throw something at her. I wanted to hurt her. I wanted her to feel the way I felt in that moment. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, as if this was happening to someone else. The woman I had loved for so long, who had stood by my side through everything, had just turned into a stranger. A person who had betrayed not only me, but her own son too. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Jacob was still standing there, his face pale and filled with regret. But there was something in his eyes, something deeper, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I don't know what to do anymore, I whispered, my voice cracking. Do what you want, Sarah replied, crossing her arms. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just done. I'm done with you. Her words landed like a heavy blow to the chest. She didn't want to fight for us. She didn't want to fix this. She was just done. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't even angry at her anymore. I was just broken. Because no matter what I did from here on out, nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days were a blur, a chaotic mix of emotions that I couldn't process. Sarah had moved into the guest room, though we both knew it was just a formality. She was done. She wasn't even trying to save face anymore. She had made her choice, and now, so had I. My whole world was shattering, and all I could do was stand there, helpless, like some spectator watching my life implode. Jacob was hardly speaking to me. I could see the guilt in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something that twisted my insides. He was ashamed, yes, but also defiant. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry it had been discovered. Sorry for getting caught. At night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Sarah and Jacob, together. I couldn't escape the image of them, not in my mind, not in my heart. I would lie there for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the family I had lost. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like before, when Sarah had lied about small things, when she'd been distant. But this was an entirely different level of hurt. She had betrayed me in the most intimate, most painful way imaginable. And Jacob, my own son, it wasn't just about the physical act anymore. It was about the trust, the bond that had been broken in ways I never thought possible. The thought that Sarah had given herself to someone else was one thing, but to give herself to my own flesh and blood, that was something I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around. I had spent years teaching Jacob the right way to be a man, the right way to treat women, and this is how he repaid me? I tried to talk to him, once. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand how this happened, but every time I looked at him, I just saw the face of someone who had no remorse. Someone who had enjoyed what he'd done and wasn't going to feel bad about it. I asked him, "Why, Jacob? How could you do this to me? To us?" And all he said was, "I don't know. It just happened." He didn't even try to justify it. He didn't even have the decency to lie to me. I wish he had lied. I think I would have preferred it if he had given me a half-hearted excuse, anything to pretend that he was still my son. But no, he was just empty. The silence between us stretched on for days. The air in the house felt suffocating. Sarah and I didn't talk much. She was cold, distant, barely acknowledging my presence. She'd started leaving the house more often, going on errands that I knew were nothing more than excuses. I didn't care anymore. If she was done, so was I. It was in those days of silence, though, that I started thinking about revenge. I hate to admit it, but the thought was there. It started as just a fleeting idea, an idle fantasy in my mind as I sat, numb, in front of the TV, pretending to watch something but really just lost in thought. But over time, that idea became more real, more possible, more necessary. I didn't know what form it would take at first. The anger was still fresh. The betrayal was too raw for me to act on anything. But every time I looked at Sarah or Jacob, the urge to hurt them back, deeply, personally, grew stronger. I didn't want them to just feel bad for a moment. I didn't want to just be angry. I wanted them to understand what they had done to me. I wanted them to experience the same kind of pain, the kind that never quite leaves you. One night, when I couldn't sleep again, I went to the living room and sat in the dark. I thought about everything Sarah had said, everything Jacob had done, and that's when the plan started to form in my head. I would make them feel the weight of what they'd done. I wouldn't just walk away from this. They thought they could get away with it, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The next few days passed in a haze, a constant loop of me going through the motions, pretending everything was normal when nothing was. I still had to go to work, still had to pick up groceries, still had to speak to people like everything was okay. But it wasn't. I felt like a stranger in my own life. One night, after another awkward dinner where Sarah barely looked at me, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep walking around like this, letting them continue their lives while I was drowning in my own grief and rage. I had to confront them, but this time, it wouldn't be about talking. It would be about action. It would be about making them feel something. I had to make them understand the depth of the hurt they had caused. I started small. In the mornings, I would casually mention things in front of them. Small, insignificant comments that would throw them off balance. I'd talk about the people at work who had supported me, how they felt sorry for me, how they couldn't believe what Sarah had done. I'd make sure they knew that people knew. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It felt like a crack in their world, like they were starting to realize that their actions had consequences. Sarah didn't seem to care. She still had that cold detachment in her eyes, like she was completely done with me. But Jacob was different. He'd started acting a little more uncomfortable around me. He would avoid my gaze, look away quickly if I caught him staring. It wasn't guilt, not really. It was more like fear. Fear that I might do something, anything, to expose him for what he had done. But what really made me see how far I was willing to go was a moment I'll never forget. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, a few weeks after the bombshell dropped. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, when Sarah walked in. She didn't say a word, just grabbed her coat and keys, ready to leave. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice calm, but my eyes were sharp. "Out," she replied, not even looking at me. "I'm meeting some friends." I didn't believe her. I hadn't believed her in weeks. The last time she'd gone out with friends, she hadn't come back until 2 a.m. I couldn't just let this go on anymore. "Really?" I said, standing up and walking toward her. "You're going to meet your friends again?" She froze for a second, and then that same look of irritation crossed her face. "You don't get to control me anymore," she snapped. "I'm going out, and I don't need your permission." That was the moment. That was the moment I saw it all clearly. The arrogance, the entitlement in her voice. She had no respect left for me. No love. She didn't care about anything I had to say. She was so far gone, so wrapped up in whatever world she was living in, that she couldn't even acknowledge what she had done to me. "I'm not the one you have to answer to," I said, my voice quieter, but there was an edge to it now. "But you'll answer to someone. Someone is going to make you understand what this feels like." She didn't even flinch, just rolled her eyes and walked out the door. That's when the plan I'd been quietly cultivating started to take shape. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the power that had been ripped away from me. I had spent so long feeling like I had no control over my life, like everything I built had been destroyed in an instant. But now, I was the one in control. I couldn't confront Sarah directly, not yet. She wasn't the weak link. She had already made it clear that she was done with me. But Jacob was different. He was the one who still needed to learn his lesson. The one who hadn't fully realized the depth of what he'd done. And it wasn't just about teaching him a lesson. No, it was more than that. I wanted him to see what it felt like to lose everything, to understand the weight of his actions. Because the truth was, I wasn't just hurt by him. I was disgusted. I started gathering information. Slowly, methodically. I watched Jacob. I kept track of where he went, who he talked to. I found out about his friends, about his online accounts, about the places he liked to go. At first, it felt like a sick game, but as time went on, it became an obsession. I had to know. I had to understand everything. The more I uncovered, the more I started to feel a strange satisfaction. He had no idea what I was capable of. He thought he could walk away from this, but I would make sure he couldn't. I started making my moves. Quietly, carefully, I manipulated the situation. I would leave things lying around the house, small things that I knew would catch Sarah's attention. A photo of me and Jacob, framed, with the caption, "Father and Son," written underneath it. A letter I'd written years ago, reminiscing about our family vacations, about how happy we were. I knew she'd see them. I knew she'd remember what she had destroyed. But I wasn't done. Jacob, too, would learn. He would regret every second of what he had done. And when it was over, when he understood the depth of his betrayal, he would feel the kind of pain I had felt, the kind that sticks with you long after everything falls apart. Things started to shift in small, subtle ways. Sarah, though still cold, became increasingly withdrawn. She didn't argue with me as much anymore, didn't snap at me the way she used to. I think she knew, on some level, that things were different now, that I wasn't the same man who had once adored her. But she was still so caught up in whatever life she was leading outside of our house, she didn't care enough to address it. She didn't care enough to salvage anything. Jacob, though, was another story. As I continued with my quiet campaign of manipulation, I began to see cracks in his armor. At first, he kept up the front. He still tried to act like everything was fine, still tried to pretend that our family hadn't just fallen apart. But there were moments, glimpses, when I saw him falter, when he would catch my eye and quickly look away, his face flush with guilt. It wasn't enough yet. He wasn't fully broken. Not yet. I could see it in him. He was torn. He had been raised with a certain set of values, taught to respect women, taught to respect me. But those values were at war with his actions. The guilt gnawed at him, but his ego, his desire for his mother, was stronger. I started pressing. Slowly, carefully, just enough to make him uncomfortable. I'd leave a little note in his room, a reminder of who we were before everything fell apart. A photo from a family trip to the beach when he was a kid. A handwritten card from a birthday when he was 10. I knew Sarah would see it. I knew she would feel the weight of it, too. The slow, relentless reminder that this was her fault, that she had destroyed everything we had, not just with me, but with Jacob. I didn't want her to be able to escape it. I wanted her to think about every single mistake she had made, every wrong choice, every lie she had told. But as the days went by, I started to wonder if I was doing this for myself more than for them. Was I trying to teach them a lesson, or was I trying to punish them for the pain I was in? Was it vengeance, or was it just a way to cope with my shattered sense of identity? There were nights when I could barely look at myself in the mirror. Who was I now? The man I had been destroyed, and the man I was becoming was someone I didn't recognize. I had become cold, calculating, someone who could think of nothing but getting back what had been taken from him. That was when I decided to push further. Jacob wasn't the same boy I had raised. Not anymore. And the truth was, deep down, I knew there was no going back. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that there was no way we could ever repair the damage. But I had to make him understand, make him feel it. I started planting seeds of doubt. I'd start conversations with people who I knew would cross paths with him. Old friends of mine, people from work. I'd casually mention how hard it was for me to trust anyone after what happened, how my world had been torn apart. It wasn't hard to make them believe me, because the story I was telling was true. But the real goal was to let Jacob hear it, to let him feel that people knew, that people understood what had happened, and that they were quietly judging him. I'd also begun looking into Sarah's life more thoroughly. Her friends were easy to track down, and I soon learned that many of them weren't just casual acquaintances, they were enablers. They were the ones who had told her that she deserved more, told her she shouldn't stay with someone who didn't appreciate her. They had convinced her that her happiness was more important than the life we had built together. They had told her that what she was doing wasn't wrong, that it was her right to seek out what she wanted, even if it meant tearing down the man who had given her everything. I couldn't stand the thought of her getting away with it, so I began planning my next move. I wasn't sure what it would look like yet, but I knew that it was coming. I had to bring down the entire house of cards, not just Sarah and Jacob. They couldn't be allowed to move on with their lives, free from the consequences of their choices. They needed to feel the depth of the destruction they'd caused. And so, I bided my time. I waited for the right moment to strike. I watched them both closely, waiting for them to make a mistake. The tension in the house grew with every passing day. The lies, the deceit, the constant low hum of everything we used to have, now hanging like a dark cloud over us. I wanted them to know that I hadn't forgotten, that I wasn't just going to roll over and let this be the end of it. And as much as I hated it, the truth was that every day I spent in this house, every silent meal, every cold interaction with Sarah, every awkward moment with Jacob, it all made me stronger. Because every minute I spent like this was a minute closer to the moment when I would unleash everything I had been planning. By the time the weeks had passed, I could feel the storm building, the pressure of it tightening around my chest like a vice. I was done playing the role of the broken, betrayed husband. I was done being the silent victim. The resentment had festered enough, and I could feel myself changing, becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who was capable of doing things I had never thought I could. But Sarah and Jacob had pushed me to this point. They had taken everything from me. Now, it was time for them to understand the consequences of their actions. I began taking small, calculated steps, laying out the foundation for what was to come. The house was already fractured, but I had to be careful. I didn't want to blow my plan too early. Every word, every action needed to land at just the right moment, just when they thought they were free from the guilt and the shame they deserved. One night, Sarah came home later than usual. She had that same glazed look in her eyes, as if she were high on some kind of power she thought she had over me. I wasn't in the mood for any of her games. I had already been thinking of the next step, the next phase of my revenge. She walked in through the front door, still on her phone, like she was too busy for anything real. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My hands were cold, but I was determined to stay calm. She rolled her eyes, the same dismissive attitude she had adopted ever since the betrayal had come to light. "Out. With friends. You know, the usual." "Why?" "Just wondering," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "You know, there's something funny about all this." She didn't even look at me as she tossed her keys onto the counter. "What now?" "I've been thinking," I said, crossing my arms. "You've spent so much time out and about, meeting your friends, yet you haven't once even tried to fix things with me. And I get it, Sarah. I know. You're done with me." Her head jerked up. "I'm not here for your guilt trip, Mark. I've told you it's over." I nodded, still calm, but the words stung. They always did. "Yeah, I get it. But there's something you might want to know." "What?" Her voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I've been talking to people," I said, watching her face carefully. "You know, people who know what happened. People who know exactly what you did. People who aren't so forgiving. They're going to remember." She paused, a quick flash of concern crossing her face before she covered it up with a scoff. "What are you talking about, Mark? You're not scaring me." I smiled, a small, cruel smile that I hadn't seen on my face in years. "I'm not trying to scare you, but you should be scared." Her phone buzzed, breaking the moment, but I could tell the tension in her had shifted. She was on edge. I wasn't the man she'd married anymore, the man who loved her blindly. No, I had changed, and she knew it. I didn't need to explain myself any further. I just walked away. That night, I made sure everything I had been setting up fell into place. Sarah had already begun to question her own choices. She had started to understand that her actions weren't as consequence-free as she had believed. The whispers I had planted, the rumors I had carefully spread, had taken root in the community, and now they would begin to bloom. I turned my attention to Jacob. He had become more withdrawn in the past couple of weeks, avoiding me more and more. He had always been sensitive, but now he was like a shadow in the house. I could tell the guilt was eating him alive, even if he didn't show it outright. His bravado had faded. He was still pretending that everything was okay, but the cracks were there, and I knew how to exploit them. One evening, when Sarah was out again, I caught him sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, though he wasn't really watching it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him. The boy I had raised. The boy I had loved. And yet, now he was a stranger to me. "Jacob," I said, my voice firm but quiet. He didn't look at me right away, but I could see him tense. I knew he had heard me. "Yeah?" he muttered, not even bothering to look up. "Come here," I ordered, and this time, he obeyed. He walked over, slowly, almost like he was walking into his own funeral. His eyes were filled with fear now, not defiance. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice low and calm, but underneath, there was an undeniable fury. "You know what you did to me, right? You know what you did to us." He nodded, but the guilt was in his eyes. The fear, too. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean for it to happen." "But it did happen," I said, my words cutting through the air. "And now we both have to live with it. But here's the thing, Jacob. You're not getting off that easy." His face paled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said slowly, "there are consequences. You think just because your mom and I aren't together anymore, you can just go on like this? Like nothing happened? Like I'm the one who's broken?" His voice trembled. I didn't want this to happen, Dad." "You think I wanted it?" I shot back, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "You think I wanted to watch everything I built crumble because of you?" The room was thick with tension now, thick with the reality of everything that had gone wrong. Jacob stood there, caught between guilt and fear, and I knew it wasn't enough. He didn't feel the depth of the pain he had caused. Not yet, but he would. That night, I laid the final pieces of my plan in motion. The truth had to come out. Sarah and Jacob couldn't hide from it any longer. They needed to face the consequences of what they had done, and I would make sure they did. Over the next few days, everything seemed to spiral faster. I could see Sarah starting to get nervous, the facade she had carefully crafted starting to crack. She wasn't as confident anymore. The rumors that had been whispered around town, about her infidelity, about her betrayal, had started to hit home. People weren't just talking behind her back. They were looking at her differently when she went to the store, or met up with her friends. There were whispers in the parking lot, hushed tones when she entered the coffee shop. Her reputation, something she had once been so proud of, was disintegrating. Jacob felt it too. I could tell. He started pulling away from his friends, avoiding the phone calls and messages. When we were at home together, the house felt more like a prison for both of us. There was no peace, no quiet moments. Everything was tense. I didn't care about the tension anymore. I wanted them both to suffer, to face what they had done. One night, I came home early from work, and Jacob was sitting on the couch. His face was pale, his hands shaking. I could see the guilt written all over him. He was unraveling. I knew the time had come. He couldn't avoid it anymore. "Jacob," I said, my voice cold, calculated. "We need to talk." He looked at me, his eyes wide. "What about?" "About your mother." "About what you did," I said, making sure he heard the finality in my words. He flinched at the mention of Sarah, but didn't argue. He knew it was coming. I wasn't going to let him hide from it anymore. The guilt had been eating him alive. It was time to show him just how far his actions had gone. "I know you're sorry," I said, pacing in front of him, "but sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't change what you did. Do you understand that?" He nodded, tears starting to well up in his eyes. I didn't know how to stop, Dad. I didn't think it was going to happen like this. It was just a mistake." "A mistake?" I snapped. "No, Jacob. A mistake is forgetting your homework or spilling coffee. What you did isn't a mistake. It's betrayal. You betrayed me. You betrayed this family. And I've been sitting here, waiting for you to get it. But I don't think you really do." I saw his chest heave as he struggled to hold back tears, but I didn't care. I didn't care about his feelings. Not anymore. He had shattered my world. Now I had to shatter his. I grabbed the envelope I had hidden behind a stack of papers on the table. "You want to know what I've been doing while you've been wallowing in guilt?" I asked, watching him look at me in confusion. I opened the envelope slowly, making a show of it. "I've been talking to people. I've been digging into your life. Your friends, Jacob. The ones who you think still have your back. The ones who think it's cool that you slept with your mother's husband." Jacob's face drained of color as I pulled out a series of pictures, screenshots of messages he had exchanged with his friends. Flirting, joking, and the most damning part, pictures of him and Sarah, taken from a private photographer who had been hired by a source who wanted to make sure the truth came out. My world was coming crashing down, but Jacob's world was collapsing around him, too. "How do you think your friends will feel when they know the truth?" I asked coldly. "You think they'll still respect you? You think they'll still look up to you? This isn't just about me. This is about your reputation, Jacob. And you just signed it away. You destroyed your own life, and for what? A few minutes of pleasure?" He looked at the pictures, his face flushed with humiliation. "Dad, please, don't do this. Please." I sat down across from him, staring him down. "You don't get to beg, Jacob. Not anymore. You don't get to get out of this so easily." He was shaking, his head in his hands, but there was no pity left in me. No more sympathy. No more apologies. "You wanted to be a man? Then face the consequences of your actions." Sarah's reaction was almost exactly what I expected. She started to unravel, too, but in a way that made me sick. Instead of owning up to anything, she lashed out. It wasn't a realization of guilt that I saw in her eyes. No, it was anger. Anger at me. Anger at how the world was falling apart around her, and how I was the one holding the mirror up to her face. You bastard, she hissed one night when I confronted her about the photos. You've been playing this game for weeks, haven't you? Trying to ruin my life. Ruin your life? I repeated, incredulous. You ruined your own life, Sarah. You and Jacob. You did this. Not me. Her lip curled in a sneer. You think I care about this little game you're playing? You think you're the only one who's been hurt here? I was miserable, Mark. You were never there for me. You didn't see me. I needed someone who cared, someone who understood. You used him, I shot back, my voice low and lethal. You used your son to make yourself feel better. That's not love, Sarah. That's not even close to it. She laughed bitterly. You think you're better than me? You think you can sit there on your high horse? You think you're the only one who's been betrayed? You're pathetic. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at her. I just felt disgusted. This woman, the one I had once called my wife, the one I had trusted, had destroyed everything for a fleeting sense of validation. And Jacob, my own son, he had followed her lead. It was beyond redemption now. A week after everything started unraveling, I decided to force a final confrontation. I called Sarah and Jacob together, both of them in the living room, where all this had started. I stood there, looking at them, and I saw how much they had already lost. They didn't even seem to recognize the family they had once been a part of. Here's the deal, I said flatly. I'm done. I'm done with you both. But this isn't just about walking away. It's about making sure you understand the cost of what you've done. Sarah's face twisted. What are you talking about? I've been in touch with a lawyer, I said, calmly watching them both. And I've made sure they know everything. The affair. The lies. The betrayal. Do you really think it's just going to end here? Jacob's face went ashen. What are you going to do? I turned my gaze to him, my words like daggers. You've already done it, Jacob. You've already ruined your life. But I'm going to make sure you both understand the weight of what you've done. This is only the beginning. I filed for divorce the next week. It wasn't about revenge at first. It was about reclaiming some semblance of dignity. But as I moved forward, the walls I had built began to close in on Sarah and Jacob. The rumors grew louder, the shame more suffocating. I pushed everything I had into the legal battle, making sure to expose every detail of their betrayal. The aftermath was brutal for both of them. Sarah lost friends. Her reputation crumbled. Jacob, who had once been popular and well-liked, was shunned by everyone. His friends, his family. He was a pariah. And the worst part? He couldn't escape the guilt. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse for them, I found out Sarah had been hiding something. A secret bank account. A stash of money she'd been funneling away from our joint account. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me smile. I used the money to fund a few key pieces of evidence that would ruin Sarah's chances in court. It wasn't just the affair anymore. It was everything. Her lies, her manipulation. It was all coming down. The court case was long, bitter, and messy. I held nothing back. Everything came out into the open. Sarah was exposed for everything she was, and Jacob, he lost everything. Their once perfect world was in shambles in the end. I walked away with the house, the assets, and full custody of Jacob. It wasn't just a win. It was an affirmation. I had taken back my life. And though the pain would always be there, I knew I had fought for what was mine. I don't know where Jacob is now. He disappeared, and I don't care to find out. Sarah, too, is out of my life. The only thing left is me, stronger, scarred, but free. And I will never forget what I've learned from this. Betrayal changes everything. And sometimes, the only way to win is to make sure they never forget what they did to you.